There we go. Okay, so thank you, everybody. And I'd like to welcome Executive Director for the Alliance for Local Economic Prosperity, Angela Merkert.
Thank you, Perry. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this noon and making time in your day for this event. Okay, so what we're interested in, especially in seed related to the public bank, is what could a public bank do to support New Mexico's economy, especially with our small business development, and which is significant in our state, even though we see a lot of headlines about the Netflixes and the Amazons and Facebook and so on coming into the state. The number of employees in small business really goes beyond the number employed in mid-size and large businesses. And next slide, please. So what we want to focus on this noon is on what is a public bank, and then what can it do to enhance the lending capacity of the state in support of small business. Our mission is, as noted here, to create local economic prosperity by maximizing equitable access to and opportunities for financial resources, which will support thriving economies throughout our state. And that is especially true. We want to focus on small businesses and rural communities where there is more challenge in getting lending support. We believe that the New Mexico revenue must be kept safe, local, and working for all New Mexicans, and that a state public bank would be one means of accomplishing greater economic prosperity. And that means, for us, sustainable communities, businesses, and families who are meeting today's needs, and also that they're in balance with the future. For us, sustainable means not just taking care of what the needs are now, but looking to the future. And that's related to environmental, the sociocultural, and economic factors, not only the economy, because we know that those are all wrapped up together. Next slide, please. Just brief mention of the state's long-range plan, the 20-year plan for New Mexico's economic development that came out, I believe it was in October or November of last year. And they emphasized the goal of building a diverse and robust economy that engages local talent, cultivates innovation, and delivers prosperity for all New Mexicans. The challenges noted included support for more socioeconomically disadvantaged communities, and also identified some of the challenges that there would be in making the plan real, as I call it. And that includes a lack of full financing capacity at that point in time when the report was issued to support the kind of economic development that they were referring to. And especially, as they noted, the need and desire to put more attention to small business development and also rural development. If we can go forward. Just a quick note here that, as I've said, we have a number of needs. We want more focused attention on small business and rural and tribal development needs and potential. And we want to support lending programs that will support the diversification and access to lending capacity by entrepreneurs, especially those from marginalized backgrounds. We also want to emphasize that the the lending that we're advocating for out of a state public bank would be done in partnership with community banks, credit unions, and community development financial institutions. I'll speak more to that as we go forward. So why do we want to make this happen? What are the forces around us? Well, we know that the pandemic recovery funds are ending. We still are getting some, but they are going to diminish over the next year. We have fossil fuel revenues that are what I call we have an abundance of them now, but those are not going to last either as more controls come into play for fossil fuel development. And we know that climate disruption is underway now. We have the effects of the wildfires, the drought, reduced water resources, decreased capacity of our agricultural areas. That's impacting not only agriculture, but other potential business development. And we're looking at 2023 to 24. We could have a public bank in operation if we pass the legislation in 2023 to make this happen. And at that point, be addressing the increased lending support that's going to be needed. SEED did a survey, conducted a survey last fall into the spring through the winter. And the number one outcome that we saw at that point that small business, those with small business interests had in mind, and their number one concern was lack of capital, lack of access to capital. And that is a major need that we want to address. In terms of how the public bank works, we're talking about creating a bank that would be owned by the state, but managed by an independent group of bank managers and a board made up of both state officials and community development people and financial people. We see the bank would carry some of the state's deposits. At any one day, the state has $3 to $7 to even $9 billion on deposit in various Wall Street banks. What this would mean is that we would be requesting as much as $60 million to start with as a deposit, and then an allocation from the general fund for $50 million for our capital. And that would be the start of our funding to enable the partner lending that would go on with the credit unions, CDFIs, and the state banks. It would, I want to note that even though a number of the community bankers are saying that they have funds, but they don't have legitimate borrowers, borrowers are saying they have good ideas, they're getting they are getting funding, but they're getting funding out of state. The two major lenders to small business developers are actually located out of state. And my question is, why can't we be using our funds to make those investments and keep that money rotating in the state? And as I note at the bottom of this slide, the first year loan demand based on 2019 figures from the Federal Reserve indicate that there's a $145 million capacity for New Mexico lending that was not being funded in 2019. And we are suspecting that that number has only increased through the pandemic, which means that the liquidity, the amount of cash that a bank has versus its what it's loaning out is high. And it is high in New Mexico in our state, in our community banks related to what's being loaned. So there is potential there. And we know that over 1,000 businesses went out of business during the pandemic. So, and there are many entrepreneurs that are coming in with new ideas for that address all of our industries in the state who could use the lending support. What I want to emphasize here is this access to lending and equity in lending. A big difference here in the actual lending programs is that there are types of lending that, due to regulatory issues or bank boards' decisions about what model they're going to use for their lending programs, that they may or may not loan. It's what I call the black box. And what it often doesn't include that we want to address and do partnership loans with the bank, with those banks, to help support participation loans with the community banks, credit unions, and CDFIs that will offer shared risk in the lending. That doesn't mean that we're going to take on more risk and have higher losses. It means that we're going to take a chance on people outside of traditional, typical numbers that people are looking at, and take into account as much the old-fashioned way of looking at character of the person, what's their track record in other business development, or just look at a wider range of factors. Looking at partial loan guarantees, substituting for collateral when it's not always available, another way of sharing risk, and then helping with liquidity with the banks. Often the challenges with entrepreneurs are getting longer term loans beyond the 3 to 5 years. Sometimes it's the smaller loans. We have a number of anecdotes from people who have had challenges, who wanted loans for $50,000 or $100,000, and they were told by their banks that they don't do that size of loan, and the bankers would rather put their time into one big $1 million loan and not deal with $10,000, $100,000 loans. So those smaller loans are still important for startups or for expansions, and we want to give support there. New business loans can be higher risk, and if they're made, they'll have probably a bit higher interest rate, but given that the state public bank would be a nonprofit, and the way that the partner loans and the administrative costs would be set up with the community banks and so on, there's still an opportunity there to keep the interest rates lower. And then, and those are the types of programs that could be addressed with the state, with the backup of the state public bank. People have asked about the collateral that the bank would have, and the Bank of North Dakota is the major example that we have of how a state public bank could operate, and in the United States at least. And they have been in existence for over 100 years, and they are backed up by the good faith and credit of the state of North Dakota. We'd like to be able to make that claim too for this bank, and make that work. After all, we have almost 30, or we did have over almost $30 billion in the permanent funds. And if that isn't good faith and credit, I'm not sure what is. It's also a bit of what lends the lower bond rates that NMFA is able to give out, because of it's building its those bond ratings on the financial viability and strength of the state of New Mexico. So we'd like to see that transferred over to the bank as well. Let's go to the next slide, and then I want to open it for questions. This is the statement of purpose, which I won't read, that is incorporated into the legislation that was presented in the 2022 session. But I want to highlight the end of that is done in the black ink, and that is in pursuit of the policies that are identified earlier in the text. The bank shall cooperate with small business development centers, regional economic development districts, and parties that have demonstrated abilities and relationships in providing financial services to new and emerging businesses. Throughout the legislation, we're making a big emphasis on small business and emerging and entrepreneurial businesses. And we think that with practices like the Small Business Administration starting to require, they've increased their required collateralization to 20%. With any more of those kinds of adjustments in loan possibilities, we see even more of a place for a state public bank in supporting the expansion of these kinds of lending programs. So to end it, we see the Public Bank of New Mexico as having a very strong role in expanding and supporting strong small business development and small business expansion in the state, leading to really thriving communities, and not just looking at the larger communities. We're talking about neighborhoods within communities too of the larger cities, but also the rural communities, our food and agriculture system, and all the related facets that go with that, with water resources and other needs that I identified earlier.